Reading of the short story A Handful of Dates by Tayyib Saleh. I must have been very young at the time. While I don't remember exactly how old I was, I do remember that when people saw me with my grandfather, they would pat me on the head and give my cheek a pinch, things they didn't do to my grandfather. The strange thing was that I never used to go out with my father. Rather, it was my grandfather who would take me with him wherever he went, except for the mornings, when I would go to the mosque to learn the Quran. The mosque, the river, and the fields, these were the landmarks in our life. While most of the children of my age grumbled at having to go to the mosque to learn the Quran, I used to love it. The reason was no doubt that I was quick at learning by heart, and the Sheikh always asked me to stand up and recite the chapter of the Merciful whenever we had visitors, who would pat me on my head and cheek just as people did when they saw me with my grandfather. Yes, I used to love the mosque, and I loved the river too. Directly we finished our Quran reading in the morning, I would throw down my wooden slate and dart off quick as a jenny to my mother, hurriedly swallow down my breakfast and run off for a plunge in the river. When tired of swimming about, I would sit on the bank and gaze at the strip of water that wound away eastward and hid behind a thick wood of acacia trees. I loved to give rein to my imagination and picture to myself a tribe of giants living behind that wood, a people tall and thin, with white beards and sharp noses like my grandfather. Before my grandfather ever replied to many questions, he would rub the tip of his nose with his forefinger, and as for his beard, it was soft and luxuriant, and as white as cotton wool. Never in my life have I seen anything of a purer whiteness or greater beauty. My grandfather must also have been extremely tall, for I never saw anyone in the whole area address him without having to look up at him. Nor did I see him enter a house without having to bend so low that I was put in mind of the way the river wound round behind the wood of acacia trees. I loved him and would imagine myself, when I grew to be a man, tall and slender like him, walking along with great strides. I believe I was his favorite grandchild. No wonder, for my cousins were a stupid bunch, and I, so they say, was an intelligent child. I used to know when my grandfather wanted me to laugh, when to be silent. Also, I would remember the times for his prayers, and would bring him his prayer rug and fill the ewer for his ablutions without his having to ask me. When he had nothing else to do, he enjoyed listening to me reciting to him from the Quran in a lilting voice, and I could tell from his face that he was moved. One day I asked him about our neighbor Masood. I said to my grandfather, "I fancy you don't like our neighbor Masood." To which he answered, having rubbed the tip of his nose, "He is an indolent man, and I don't like such people." I said to him, "What is an indolent man?" My grandfather lowered his head for a moment, then looking across at the wide expanse of field, he said, "Do you see it stretching out from the edge of that desert up to the Nile bank? 100 fathoms. Do you see all those date palms and those trees? Sand, acacia and soil? All this fell into Masood's lap, was inherited by him from his father. Taking advantage of the silence that had descended upon my grandfather, I turned my gaze from him to the vast area defined by his words. I don't care, I told myself, who owns those date palms, those trees, or his black, cracked earth. All I know is that it is the arena for my dreams and my playground. My grandfather then continued, "Yes, my boy, 40 years ago all this belonged to Masood. 2/3 of it is now mine." This was news to me, for I had imagined that the land had belonged to my grandfather ever since God's creation. I didn't own a single fedon when I first set foot in this village. Masood was then the owner of all these riches. The position has changed now though, and I think that before Allah calls to him, I shall have bought the remaining third as well. I don't know why it was I felt fear at my grandfather's words and pity for our neighbor Masood. How I wished my grandfather wouldn't do what he had said. I remembered Masood singing, his beautiful voice and powerful laugh that resembled the gurgling of water. My grandfather never used to laugh. I asked my grandfather why Masood had sold his land. Women. And from the way my grandfather pronounced the word, I felt that women was something terrible. Masood, my boy, was a much married man. Each time he married, he sold me a fedon or two. I made the quick calculation that Masood must have married some 90 women. Then I remembered his 3 wives, his shabby appearance, his lame donkey, and its dilapidated saddle, his jalaba with the torn sleeves. I had all but rid my mind of the thoughts that jostled in it when I saw the man approaching us. My grandfather and I exchanged glances. "We will be harvesting the dates today," said Masood. "Don't you want to be there?" I felt as though he did not really want my grandfather to attend. My grandfather, however, jumped to his feet, and I saw that his eyes sparkled momentarily with an intense brightness. He pulled me by the hand and we went off to the harvesting of Masood's dates. Someone brought my grandfather a stool covered with an ox hide while I remained standing there. There was a vast number of people there, but though I knew them all, I found myself for some reason watching Masood. Aloof from that great gathering of people, he stood as though it were no concern of his, despite the fact that the date palms to be harvested were his own. Sometimes his attention would be caught by the sound of a huge clump of dates crashing down from on high. Once he shouted up at the boy perched on the very summit of the date palm, who had begun hacking at a clump with his long sharp sickle. "Be careful you don't cut the heart of the palm." No one paid any attention to what he said, and the boy seated at the very summit of the date palm continued quickly and energetically to work away at the branch with his sickle, till the clump of dates began to drop like something descending from the heavens. I, however, had begun to think about Masood's praise, the heart of the palm. I pictured the palm tree as something with feeling, something possessed of a heart that throbbed. I remembered Masood's remark to me when he had seen me playing about with the branch of a young palm tree. Palm trees, my boy, like humans, experience joy and suffering. And I had felt an inward and unreasoned embarrassment. When I again looked at the expanse of ground stretching before me, I saw my young companions swarming like ants around the trunks of the palm trees, gathering up dates and eating most of them. The dates were collected into high mounds. I saw people coming along and weighing them into measuring bins and pouring them into sacks, of which I counted 30. The crowd of people broke up, except for Hussain the merchant, Musa the owner of the field next to ours on the east, and two men I had never seen before. I heard a low whistling sound and saw that my grandfather had fallen asleep. Then I noticed that Masood had not changed his stance, except that he had placed a stalk in his mouth and was munching at it like someone surfeited with food who doesn't know what to do with the mouthful he still has. Suddenly my grandfather woke up, jumped to his feet and walked towards the sacks of dates. He was followed by Hussain the merchant, Musa the owner of the field next to ours, and the two strangers. I glanced at Masood and saw that he was making his way towards us with extreme slowness, like a man who wants to retreat but whose feet insist on going forwards. They formed a circle around the sacks of dates and began examining them, someone taking a date or two to eat. My grandfather gave me a fistful, which I began munching. I saw Masood filling the palms of both hands with dates and bringing them up close to his nose, then returning them. Then I saw them dividing up the sacks among them. Hussain the merchant took 10. Each of the strangers took 5. Musa the owner of the field next to ours on the eastern side took 5. My grandfather took 5. Understanding nothing, I looked at Masood and saw that his eyes were darting about to left and right like two mice that have lost their way home. "You're still 50 pounds in debt to me," said my grandfather to Masood. "We'll talk about it later." Hussain called his assistants and they brought along donkeys. The two strangers produced camels and the sacks of dates were loaded onto them. One of the donkeys let out a braying, which set the camels frothing at the mouth and complaining noisily. I felt myself drawing close to Masood, felt my hand stretch out toward him, as though I wanted to touch the hem of his garment. I heard him make a noise in his throat like the rasping of a lamb being slaughtered. For some unknown reason, I experienced a sharp sensation of pain in my chest. I ran off into the distance, hearing my grandfather call after me. I hesitated a little, then continued on my way. I felt at the moment that I hated him. Quickening my pace, it was as though I carried within me a secret I wanted to rid myself of. I reached the river bank near the bend it made behind the wood of acacia trees. Then, without knowing why, I put my finger into my throat and spewed up the dates I had eaten.